right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Amazing to be in Cape Town as usual. This morning I'll share a couple of slides. Not that many, 155 slides. So bear with me. No, just way less. Don't worry. We're going to talk about a lot of figures. I'm going to throw a lot of data at you. But just before going into that, just want to say that I'm not the only one crunching this data all year long. So just wanted to say a few words on my colleague Elodie, who is based in Cameroon, Max Cuvelier, who is on his way to Tunis at the moment. So we are a little bit spread across the continent. And so yeah, it's not just me behind all this. As Christophe said, I work mainly with an organization called the Catalyst Fund, and we invest in climate adaptation startups across Africa. And on my spare time, I'm doing this, Africa the Big Deal. So let's go into the numbers. On the left side is this is how things started 10 years ago, less than 30 deals across the continent in the entire year, and about $120 million of funding overall. Fast forward 10 years later, 2022, and this is not even the end of the year. We have more than 800 deals completed already in the continent, and more than $4 billion of funding in total, which is a multiplier of 34. If this was a startup, it would be, realistically good investment. So yeah, it's been quite amazing witnessing this journey over the past 10 years. All right, let's look more specifically at how things evolve over the past 4 years. Funding to date, updated as of last night, is $4.4 billion. There was actually a fairly large deal announced yesterday that topped up by 150 million. And that represents a 26% year-on-year growth compared to last year, which is pretty amazing when you think about the global context. And actually talking about global context, we can see that until the third quarter this year, Africa was the only continent showing growth year-on-year if we compare quarter by quarter across the different regions. And even even if third quarter and fourth quarter might be a little bit below what last year's was, overall, Africa is the only continent to still show positive startup funding growth year-on-year. Ahead of LATAM, ahead of Europe, ahead of Asia, ahead of the US, in terms of funding growth this year. Another way to look at it is that basically as of today, we have already reached 87% actually, things change, and now we're actually at 95% of the total amount of funding that was raised last year. If you compare with other regions, there's no way this will be done in any other region. So when it comes to VC funding, we can realistically say that Africa is the most dynamic region globally this year, which is pretty exciting when you think about it. This being said, behind the overall continent figures, there are some strong discrepancies across the different markets. We can see that in Kenya and Egypt, for instance, the total amount of funding raised already has been already more than last year. Here we're talking about dollars, not number of deals. In Nigeria and South Africa, it's a little bit more complicated. When we look at number of deals, actually, again, in Kenya and Egypt, it's still comparable to last year, and even a little bit higher in terms of number of deals comparing year on year. Nigeria as well. Again, South Africa is a little bit below. On the rest of Africa, there's also a strong growth in number of deals. Okay, now if we dig a little bit deeper in terms of the country by country analysis, we can see that close to 80% of the total funding in the continent goes mainly to 4 markets that we tend to call the big 4: Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, South Africa. This is not a new trend. It's been like that last year and the year before. Last year was 82%. This year is 78%. What's interesting though is when we start looking at the countries in blue, that are basically all pushing to join this club of the big 4. Ghana is really close to that, with $388 million funding raised this year only. And then we start seeing really a lot of new ecosystems that are growing fairly fast. Algeria, Tunisia, Senegal, Uganda, DRC, and so on. So that's very exciting. And I'm sure we're going to see these countries continuing in that trajectory. When we look at sectors, one thing that we have all witnessed over the past 3 or 4 years is the growth of fintech. There was a very good McKinsey paper a couple of weeks ago titled "Fintech: The End of the Beginning," referring to the fact that the way fintech is offered across the continent is changing and going deeper. Interestingly, we can reuse that to say also that pure fintech players, in terms of percentage of funding raised, is going a bit lower this year for the first time. So in the past 4 years, it's been only growing. Last year was 53% of the total funding in the continent that went to fintech startups. This year, we are just 30%. This being said, we're also seeing fintech embedded in other kind of startups, whether it's in agriculture or even in healthcare, where you have sometimes a fintech component as well. Okay, today is day 2 of the COP27 conference, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And the good news is that we're also seeing an increased amount of funding going to environment and climate sectors in Africa. If you look at last year, we were just north of $500 million of funding that went to energy, water, agriculture, food, and waste management. This year, and we have sort of 2 months to go, there's already over $1 billion funding that went to these sectors, which represents 25% of the total funding in the continent. And there's a number of VC funds, like Catalyst Fund, with whom I'm privileged to work with, that are specifically looking at this sector, or sometimes even launching specific funds with the climate angle. That's super encouraging. I mean, all this is very new developments, and it's great to see that more and more funding is going to that critically needed sector. Going back a little bit to the type of deals we're seeing, what's interesting, and we're not expecting necessarily to see exactly that, especially for the left part, when we looked at this data, is that you have actually more large rounds, so above $1 million, this year already than you had last year. So we have already 337 deals above $1 million that were closed this year in the continent. On the other side, what explains the relative slowdown in third quarter and fourth quarter is the fact that we have less what we call mega deals, so $100 million plus deals. We had 13 last year. Now we're at 9. It's fairly unlikely that we will get to 13. And that explains the drop, especially in the second half of the year. All right, this is not a good news. Gender balance in funding. So here what you can see is the funding raised by startup in Africa by gender of the CEO. 2019, 6% of the total funding went to female founders. 2020 dropped to 3%. 2021 went back to 6%, and we are back to 3%. That basically says that things haven't changed much. And it's pretty much the same when we look at the funding teams. What you can see in blue is the amount of funding that just go to male-led startups, only male founders and co-founders. So 84% of the total funding this year just went to male founders. And in yellow is the tiny bit that just went to female-only founders and co-founders. That's something that we always say we hope this will change. Conference after conference, year after year, everybody says we hope this will change. I think hope will not do anything about that, but collectively as an ecosystem, we can change this. And especially, I'm a strong believer of the fact that investors have a role to play there. In Catalyst Fund, for instance, we have a mandate with our LPs to allocate at least 30% of our funding to female-led startups. And I think it's critical that a number of investors look at investment with a gender lens. If things don't change in investment committee rooms, these stats would not change. And maybe the first step is also for some of the fund managers to be women in the first place. So there's a lot to be changed, but yeah, I really hope it's the last time we see such depressing statistics. And we're all working out to change that. All right, in terms of the investors, so people on the other side from all these deals, we have a number of investors that are fairly active in the ecosystem. Here we just look at the activity by the number of deals, not the amount of dollars spent, which is another stat. But if we just look at the number of deals, so most of them, of course, are early stage, pre-seed, seed stage. We have basically these three guys who are leading the pack: Launch Africa, YC, and Lofty Inc. And if we look at the rest of the list, what's interesting is that for a number of them, they don't just provide capital, they also provide acceleration or venture building together with the seed or pre-seed stage investment. That's the case of Flat Six Labs, On Deck, Plug and Play, Norscan, and so on. But if you think about it, yeah, if you look at some of the top ones there, more than 50 deals in a year, it's pretty impressive track record. Where does the money come from? So when we look at where these active investors are based, basically out of the 1,200 or so investors who have closed at least one deal in the past 2 years in the continent, a third of them are based in Africa. Then about 37% of them are based in North America, but basically that means the US, roughly speaking. And then the rest is Europe and Asia mainly. If we had done the same stat 3-4 years ago, the ratio, basically the part in yellow here, the ratio of Africa headquartered investors would have been much smaller, closer to 20%. So that's definitely growing. And now, what's exciting is that we're seeing, if we look at the deals above $1 million that were closed in the past 3 years, the number of them that are seeing participation of Africa headquartered investor is definitely growing. And now 60% of the deals that were closed this year in the continent that were above $1 million had at least one Africa investor. So that's very encouraging, and again, a testimony of the dynamism of the ecosystem. All right, with Africa, the big deal, we try to avoid doing projections and pronostics, and really just look at the actual data. But it's early November. We can make some projection on what will happen in the next 6 weeks. And yeah, we are already at, as I said, $4.4 billion, and we believe this year will be the first year that the continent reaches $5 billion of total funding for the entire continent. So yeah, really believe that we'll get to this $5 billion mark. And yeah, the coming weeks will tell us. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Everything you have seen up there is online, available. And yeah, feel free to take a deeper look. Yeah, that's it.